Hello, and this is Hayden Roberts with the second presentation related to the Introduction to World Regional Geography. This particular presentation will focus a lot on physical geography, but we will talk more about different factors that go into the development of regional geography from the human geographic standpoint. So the natural environment has many factors across the globe, and of course there are lots of physical scientists who spend their entire careers dealing with environmental issues, environmental change. Certainly weather is one particular factor, probably one of the factors that you're most conscious of or most connected to by virtue of your day-to-day environment, but also because we are confronted with it or updates on it on the nightly news or the morning news. The weatherman has become a major part of the news that's reported locally, and so we are very conscious of that, particularly here in Oklahoma. Within the understanding about climate or understanding about weather, there's kind of many factors that we can take into account, and these factors affect climate factors affect human understanding about regional geography, and certainly where humans live and how we define different realms around the world. In a broad way, one of the things that we sort of should understand about atmosphere and about climate is how essentially we live in a giant greenhouse. The ability for nature, which includes the development of animals on this planet, is the result of what they call the greenhouse effect. Now, oftentimes you hear the word greenhouse effect and it relates to the rising temperature of the overall globe, but more than just the rising temperature, we constantly live in a greenhouse environment. There's certain aspects or certain layers of the atmosphere that protect us from the sun, that keeps the earth from being too hot or too cold at any given time of the year, as well as protects us from radiation that's emitted by the sun. The most important layer that sort of helps with this process is the ozone layer, which some of you have probably heard that the ozone layer is shrinking at the poles, and that was one of the first indicators that the climate of the world might be changing for the worse. But certainly we still live, the ozone, even regardless of it shrinking or becoming smaller in certain areas, we still are protected by it on a daily basis. The rotation of the earth, of course you probably know this as well, determines the seasons. The rotation of the earth determines the days of the year, as well as the 24-hour period. The earth kind of rotates on its axis, but then it also rotates around the sun. So there's sort of two rotations that the earth engages. Months and seasons are based on where the earth is in that rotation around the sun process. Depending on how the earth faces the sun determines where the sun is positioned in the sky, whether in the northern hemisphere or the southern hemisphere, and that sort of flip-flops or changes. That's what creates the seasonal effect. The seasons in North America are directly opposite what they are in South America. So, for example, when it is winter in North America, it is summer in South America. When it is fall in South America, it is spring in North America. Another thing that affects atmosphere is the transfer of water. Of course, as the sun, is coming down on the earth at different rates depending on the seasons or the months. There's a different evaporation, not melting, well, melting in terms of the ice caps, but evaporation in terms of the overall sea, which affects the transfer of water. You witness the transfer of water, whether it comes off the mountains or off the ocean, in the form of clouds, storm systems. The most dramatic, transfer of water that we see every year is hurricane season, where the warm waters are evaporating around the equator, off, in the case of North America, off the coast of Africa is where those waters evaporate, creating large storm systems that then get pushed by winds up the east coast of the United States. Depending on where you are in terms of latitude, if you remember I said in my last presentation that latitude tends to determine weather, is that the higher the latitude, the closer you are to a polar climate. The lower the latitude or closer that you are to the equator, you end up with the tropical climate. And there's a belt around the Earth, north and south of the equator, that represents the tropical climates of the world. That belt, the sort of higher end of that belt, the northern end of that belt, is the Tropic of Cancer, and the lower end of that belt is the Tropic of Capricorn. Given those names because they are directly above these belt lines are the constellations of Cancer and Capricorn. Global climate change is constantly in flux, not just because of global warming, but also because of natural weather changes, cycles of weather change that occur across the globe. This map gives you an idea kind of about these belt effects. Here's the Tropic of Cancer at 30 degrees latitude, and the Tropic of Capricorn, also 30 degrees latitude on the south end of the pole. And you can see that temperatures, for the most part, are pretty constant around the world depending on where you are. There are pockets of where it does get colder in certain places as opposed to others. For example, this purple pocket where it says that it's below 40 degrees Celsius is Siberia. Siberia is sort of famously the sort of Russian cold zone. The reason why it's colder in Siberia than in most parts of that same latitude is because so much of Siberia is landlocked. If you look at Canada at the same latitude, all of that is open sea, or with somewhere either sea or part of the transition between the Arctic Ocean and the Atlantic or Pacific Ocean. And so you get water currents that raises the temperature slightly above what it's like where you have a landlocked area like Siberia. This diagram kind of gives you a little bit idea about weather transition throughout the world. Essentially, like I'd said, hurricane season, which tends to start around late July for North America and continues into late October, early November. Essentially, you have hurricanes, you have strong evaporation occurring in this kind of region between the equator and the Tropic of Cancer. What happens with water, evaporating water, is it turns into clouds, and then you have trade winds that push those clouds up the North Atlantic into, depending on where the jet stream, which runs in this direction, meets the trade winds, it will either push the storm system into the Caribbean Sea or the Gulf of Mexico, or it'll push it up the coast of North America. The same thing happens in the South Pacific as well. You have hurricanes that come and hit the western coast of the Americas, the Western Hemisphere, but we don't tend to have hurricanes in places like California because of the way that California sits further up. You can kind of see how California actually sits a little bit to the north of where the southeastern United States sits. And so therefore hurricanes tend to hit the coast of Mexico, the Baja areas. Sometimes they come in through San Diego, but generally what happens is they come around and then go back out to sea. You find lots of hurricane conditions, certainly in places like Hawaii, the South Pacific, but in terms of the United States, typically most hurricanes in the United States occur along the eastern seaboard. What happens though is as these winds move further north, these hurricanes or tropical storms, they aren't always as dramatic as hurricanes, but certainly tropical storms move. They hit cooler water, and so those clouds start to dissipate or start to drop in intensity and volume, and therefore they turn from clouds back into water. It's simply reabsorbed by the ocean, and then eventually those waters move their way further south because of oceanic currents, and the cycle starts all over again. This also happens on the land as well, but oceans are the most dramatic way that you see this. But what you find is on land, mountainy areas like the Andes Mountains or the Rocky Mountains, you end up with a lot of melting of snow, which creates storm effects. Those storms then come across. Most storms here in Oklahoma, for example, start in the Rocky Mountains, and with the melting of snow, high altitude, sun hitting high altitude snow, melting it, creating clouds, the jet stream carrying those clouds easterly, and then as they move easterly, they either pick up more precipitation from oceans or just simply start to, as they start to evaporate over the plains or other places in North America, that's where we get our rain. Tornadoes come about when these sort of warmer airs, colder airs meet, drier air, wetter air meets, and it creates more traumatic weather conditions. This gives you a little bit idea about precipitation around the world. The lighter areas are more dry. This, for example, is the Sahara Desert, the Arabian Desert, the Gobi Desert, and so these are the drier areas of the world. You'll notice that drier areas of the world are also in polar places because most of the precipitation is frozen. There's also a big pocket of dry areas on the western coast of the South America. The Andes are actually a more drier region, even though the mountains aren't as tall as the Himalayas, which are over here. This area is much drier because of the way that the ocean comes off of the way that the weather comes off the ocean and hits the mountains. It creates almost like a barrier. In fact, the reason why you have such dense tropical rainforests and lots of precipitation here in Brazil is because of this line of mountains, very tall mountains that keeps the ocean air from changing, and so it creates a kind of sort of intensified greenhouse effect over the Amazon canopy. Something else to consider is that this is sort of an average precipitation diagram. You'll find that depending on certain weather effects, whether it be this kind of North Atlantic effect that occurs up here, or the El Nino effect that occurs down in through here, it will affect the amount of precipitation that places like the southeastern United States, the southwestern United States will receive. What tends to happen is when the southeastern United States is in drought-like conditions, the southwest is getting a fair amount of precipitation, and vice versa. When the southwest is receiving its share of precipitation, although naturally more dry than the rest of the United States, the southeast tends to have drought-like conditions. And there's usually about a 5 to 10 year switch between the El Nino and La Nina effects. In North America, it's a more regular cycle because of its close proximity to the Arctic Ocean. You get a constant sort of churning or sort of reconstituting of water vapor in this area, and so you find that the climates of Europe in New England are more consistent than they are in other places in the world. That's why you end up with, more fertile regions, and the climates there. They don't get a tremendous amount of snow typically, but they do get regular rainfall, but not an overabundance of rainfall. The lithosphere is essentially the pocket of the world that we actually occupy, that we live in. It's the physical human landscape. And it's where the weather occurs, it's where erosion occurs and deposition occurs. It's also where plate tectonic occurs. Above the lithosphere is where you get into higher altitude atmospheric conditions like the ozone layer, where animals can't live. Certainly humans can't live without oxygen, but even birds can't fly to a certain altitude before they start to lose oxygen. So lithosphere is at kind of that sweet spot that life is allowed to exist on the planet Earth. Of course, below the lithosphere is when you start to get into the crust and the mantle and other layers underneath the ground. But that lithosphere is that kind of environment that we occupy. On the lithosphere, and I should say this, that it's the lithosphere that is what geographers are most interested in. Geographers don't tend to deal with upper atmospheric conditions, and it's geologists that deal with things below the lithosphere, in the crust or in the mantle, or other the core, other areas below the surface. So on this lithosphere, we basically occupy a series of shelves that are almost like gigantic floating islands. They float on rivers or oceans of lava, mantle, molten rock. And these shelves constantly are crashing into each other. Different shelves are sort of falling underneath other shelves. And this is how we end up both with the tectonic effect, in other words, volcanoes, earthquakes, etc., but also the movement of the continents around the world. You can sort of see the African shelf right here sort of meets the South American, North American shelf underneath the Atlantic Ocean. This is an area where you have great divide occurring between the two continents. At one time, you can sort of physically see how at one time South America and Africa sort of fit together, but this crust is constantly pushing or creating new rock because of the up push of underground volcanoes of volcanic rock. It's pushing South America further apart from Africa. Same thing is true with North America. But at one time, they sort of talk about that. You probably may have heard the term the continent of Pangaea. Back during the time of the dinosaurs, all the continents were sort of one big continent with one big ocean that surrounded it. And since then, there's been tremendous movement of these continents. Like I said, South America moving further away from Africa. Another big dramatic move is that India used to be part of Eastern Africa. It used to sort of occupy this kind of Horn of Africa area, and it millions of years ago separated from Africa, and for several million years was basically a floating island, not unlike think of Australia, just kind of floating out there as its own large continent. Eventually it crashes into southern Asia, and that's where we get the Himalayan mountains. And so the Himalayan mountains are not only the largest mountain range in the world, they continually will be the largest mountain range in the world because the Indian continent is continuing to push further and further up into Asia. These kinds of shelves or that exist also can determine plant life, species, and different changes in the biology of parts of continents. You can see that this kind of purple area represents a different shelf from the rest of Asia, and as a result, you have different kinds of animals that have developed over time This is a more tropical region, partly because it's a big peninsula that creates a more tropical environment similar to what we see in Florida, but also because it's south of the Himalayan mountains. So north of here, you end up with a more temperate environment, or even colder, drier environment. In India, it's very tropical, very warm. Same thing with Australia, tropical along its coastlines, desert in the interior. But you also, Australia is sort of famous for having a very different set of animals than they do. Things like platypuses and kangaroos exist in Australia, where they don't exist just a few islands away in the Southeast Asian rim. So ecosystems, you've I'm sure heard of the term ecosystem, may not know what it kind of means. It basically, it and biomes are really about trying to understand the totality of the natural environment, how plants and animals interrelate, how different layers of animals, predators and prey, have interconnections between each other. Biomes are sort of a larger understanding about regional ecology. Regional, thinking about the world. If you sort of don't think about the world from a political perspective, but instead think about it from an environmental perspective, regional geography from an environmental perspective, you would sort of deal with it from the perspective of biomes, these sort of forest or grassland kinds of biomes. There's also sort of soil changes that occur based on these different ecological environments. This diagram, which is pretty common in your book, sort of describes or sort of highlights the different biomes or climates around the world. And what you can see here, though, is that certainly some countries extend past their local ecology, but certain environmental conditions sort of dictate the boundaries of certain countries, because once you move from one biome to another, what happens is there's a change. There tends to be a change in social, cultural conditions, and so that then changes political or national or even economic boundaries. For example, you'll notice that the Saharan countries, there's sort of a fine pink line that sort of corresponds with these sub-Saharan nations right here along the edge of the Saharan desert. These countries sort of operate in a very different capacity. They tend to be more nomadic, whereas these countries are more sedentary, more farmer-related businesses, and because the climate changes so dramatically, and so therefore country boundaries sort of correspond a little bit through here. Same thing is true over here in Southeast Asia. South Asia, the border of India and China really is the Himalayan mountains, because it is a natural barrier. You see that, of course, over here when you have the thinning of the continent between North and South America, creates a natural barrier. So humans have lots of impact on these biomes. Certainly farming is one impact. You see that farming, essentially changes the local flora, doing away with native plants. You see this a lot in Oklahoma, for example. We sort of go out to the rural areas and think that is a more natural environment, but in fact it's just as affected. Rural areas are just as affected by the natural environment, is just as affected by humans as urban environments, because most of the plants that grow along the side of the road are brought in there by humans in this day and age, either because of farming or because of the migration of humans bringing in either directly or inadvertently plants from other parts of the continent, or even other continents for that matter. Desertification does occur as a result of humans as well, because humans desire the control of water for agricultural reasons, as well as for urbanization reasons. What often can happen is the damming or moving of water from one natural place to another using canals or other kinds of man-made structures can affect the ecology. Industrial revolution, atmospheric pollution are sort of tied together. These are, of course, with economic development, the rise of more wealthier nations, comes more factories as well as more pollution. Pollution, is created by the manufacturing of stuff, as well as the manufacturing of power creates pollution. Coal-fired plants, petroleum-fired plants for the production of electricity is just as dramatic on the environment as coal-fired plants that produce steel or automobiles or other goods. People, as I said in the last presentation, people are central to the understanding of regional geography. People are the ones that create regions around the world. They don't naturally occur. We observe certain characteristics in the environment, and then we create regions based on those characteristics. Some of those characteristics are physical in nature, but also it has to do with human conditions such as population density, physiological density, urban versus rural areas are another way of sort of dividing regions up. Here's a map of population around the world. To no surprise, South and Eastern Asia are the most populated places in the world. China has about 1 in 5 of the total population living in its borders. India is pretty close behind. In fact, they say that India's population will surpass China's population within the next few decades. Of course, there's other places in the world that are also highly populated. Europe is a very populated part of the world. You have places like West Africa that are highly populated, the interior sections of Eastern Africa, Saudi Arabia. This is a vast desert, and so most of the population tends to be concentrated along the coastal areas. Certainly Mexico, Brazil, the United States, highly populated places in the world. In fact, the United States is, by population, is the third or fourth largest nation, kind of depends, in the world after you get outside of the East Asian countries. And that's because it has lots of land, high population, but it doesn't have the density that you see in Asia. Even though we have one of the biggest populated countries in the world, it has a lot more to do with our size and the size of our urban areas than it does with the kind of density that you have in China, which is both dense in a urban and rural environment. When we think about rural and urban environments, oftentimes the population density has a lot to do with economic success. So the more economically challenged a region is, there tends to be more people living in a rural environment. And that's because rural environments allow for poorer nations or poor populations to grow their own food or to have closer access to natural resources. In more economically successful places like North America and Europe, farming has become so successful over the last century that we don't require as many individuals to be engaged in the practice of farming to produce the same or even more food than was consumed in the past. And so therefore people are free to look at other professions, or oftentimes required to look for other professions outside of agriculture. It's not the case in places like Southeast Asia and Africa and many parts of Latin America. When we talk about population, there's sort of demographics is a term that often comes up. Demographics is sort of the makeup of the population, both from a racial, ethnic, gender perspective. Demographics deals with economics, education. There's a whole host of age groups. There's a whole host of ways of understanding demographics. The United States Census Bureau does a study every 10 years of the demographics of the United States. It's actually required in the United States Constitution that they measure the demographics of the United States and report that data. And of course, we use that data for a variety of economic reasons, as well as political reasons, boundaries of congressional districts, legislative districts, as well as where we're going to build the next roads, and how do we account for spending on social service programs. Within the understanding of population, of course, there is a birth rate and a death rate. There's a certain number of infants born every year, as well as a certain number of people dying every year. And of course, there is always been since the late Middle Ages, there's always been a positive growth in population around the world. There's more people being born than there are dying, and there's lots of factors that lead into that. One of the factors is the infant mortality rate. In places of the world like the United States, or even in China for that matter, the infant mortality rate is quite low because we have provided better medical service, and so therefore infants live a longer life. Migration also affects these kind of population, not in terms of the total population of the world, but in terms of where people live in the world, and certainly populations in the United States. The United States, or the territory of the United States 200 years ago was quite low. Population was quite low, but because of migration, primarily from Europe, but certainly over the years from other places in the world to this place, population has grown. But we are looking at big concerns about overpopulation. China famously had its one-child law up until recently, where only families can only have one child. It sort of worked, but it didn't work. There were sort of side effects to that, which I can talk more about when we get to that region of the world. But this kind of gives you a diagram, an interesting diagram about how you see total population change, that countries where the infant mortality rate as well as the life expectancy rate is much lower, the infant mortality rate is high, life expectancy rate is low, you end up with people having more children. But as that life expectancy grows, the infant mortality rate decreases. Countries tend to have fewer children, like the United States and Japan have a lower growth rate because people live longer and kids are living longer. These are the projected population growth. There are some people that find this incredibly alarming. These are projections, but it has a lot to do with science. It has a lot to do with increased medical care, as well as transferring that medical care into developing nations as well. It is more likely that this population growth will slow in developing nations as better medical care is provided. And so even though this presents a kind of dramatic rise, certainly that rise is likely, but it is probably more on the lower end than on the higher end. Thomas Malthus, Robert Malthus, was the scientist from the late 18th, early 19th century who sort of projected that population growth would occur exponentially, which is what we have observed. He sort of brought in a variety of factors that lead to that. There are, many considerations, cultural considerations like religion, affects population, local population, whether or not, birth control, for example, is allowed, regardless of, the kinds of birth controls that are available. Political issues, turmoil, war will affect population growth or decrease. Economics, can you afford to have a child, based on the current local environment? That's some of the reason why in places like hyper-urban areas like New York or Chicago, people tend to have fewer children, because it's just so expensive to have children and certainly live in, adequate housing. And the natural environment, places that are warmer, that tend to allow for families to grow, people to to have more opportunities to procreate, people living outside more, in rural areas, allow for people to sort of expand and therefore populations expand, as opposed to colder environments where people tend to huddle or live closer together. We're now going to move kind of more towards this kind of political, social, cultural issues in this particular introduction. Political geography, is basically, a big primary focus on geography, or continual focus on geography today. How are maps drawn? Where do people align? There'll be an interesting map that I'll show you about Africa that talks about indigenous people in particular, and the fact that political boundaries and indigenous or national boundaries don't always match up and can create huge challenges. There are lots of discussions when we talk about geography and politics that relate to governments. Where do we find democracy flourishing, and where is it challenged, and why is it challenged? As well as locations of things like capital cities is something that often comes up with political geography. It's no coincidence that the Washington D.C., the nation's capital, is both along a coastal area as well as right next to New York City, the largest economic driver of our nation. And so when we talk about political geography, it's actually kind of interesting study just dealing with political geography, because of course there is no real global government that exists. The United Nations exists, but it really is more of a trade agreement and a political and military agreement that emerged after World War II. There's a lot of discontent that occurs in the United Nations. It really is more of a forum for voicing discontent than it is for finding solutions, unfortunately. But when dealing with political geography, oftentimes it's helpful to think about the United Nations as well as think about the relationships between different governments. How do we end up with different alliances? How is it that, for example, NATO, is formed as a defensive treaty between Canada, the United States, and Western Europe? Well, it was something that came out of conflicts, Cold War conflicts with the Soviet Union and its neighboring countries. Why do we end up with the European Union? There's lots of different kinds of multinational groups that are not of the same scale as the United Nations, but are still very relevant and very interesting, as well as non-governmental agencies that have a big impact globally. The Red Cross, seems to be everywhere whenever there's a crisis, or the Red Crescent is sort of the Islamic sister organization to the Red Cross. With political geography, I sort of think of political geography and economic geography as hand in hand. We will talk a lot as we enter each of these regions about wealth and poverty. There's an assignment that I assign that allows you to compare two countries of different economic statuses and why are they economically why is one more economically developed than the other. Economics is sort of measured in two ways. You either measure it through the PPP, which is sort of the per capita amount of money that people earn, which is a kind of interesting way of thinking about it. The United States is one of the wealthier nations. It sort of occupies that top 45 country tier. China, the largest economy in the world, right there with the United States, though, the per capita income is well below the United States. So there's two different ways of thinking about the economic success of a country. One way is what is the purchasing power of an individual within that country? How do you measure that across the population? The other is gross domestic product. How much stuff are people producing, or is a nation producing, is another way of thinking about economic development. So the United States has a high PPP as well as a high GNP. China, for example, equal in GDP to the United States, gross domestic product to the United States, but the purchasing power, the PPP, is much lower. And so, anyway, it's different ways of thinking about the successes of nations. With success also comes a lot of economic development, as well as wider use of resources, and increased pollution. And so here's an example of how Kenya, for example, an economically struggling country, doesn't use as much resources or have as much material wealth as the United States. And of course, because of that, the United States becomes the biggest. They sort of describe the United States as being the biggest polluter in the world. What that basically means is the United States, contributes adversely the most to the global environment, and so we are the ones that tend or have been recently trying to lead the way in terms of making changes to pollution laws and trying to reduce greenhouse gases and other negative effects, because we're the ones that if we make the most change, it'll have the greatest impact globally. So when we talk about economics, like I said, there are wealthier nations, less wealthy nations. The way that we understand economics is by understanding the production or the distribution of goods, and each country sort of has different layers in the economic stratification. The four major stratifications are primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary. Primary basically relates to nations or industries, but then certain countries are dominated by these stratifications. So certain industries that relate to the primary production are like mining, fishing, farming, herding animals, or are all part of that kind of primary level. The secondary level deals more with manufacturing. What do you do when you take the raw stuff like lumber and iron ore, or even food for that matter, and transfer it into something else, the manufacturing, secondary production? When they talk about industrialization, they're usually talking about the rise of the secondary level of production activity in a particular country. Tertiary deals more with the service industry, and that can range anywhere from people who work at McDonald's to doctors and lawyers. Tertiary has nothing to do with how much people earn. Quaternary is more dealing with management of information as well as intellectual property, the development of stuff. So you think of Silicon Valley, the development of programming, new technologies, that would be quaternary, as well as the management of these kinds of services like cell phone service or cable companies would occupy the quaternary, because they're providing communication, they're sort of controlling communication links. The United States most people in the United States today, in our what we call post-industrial society, in other words, most people in the United States no longer make their living off of the secondary level of production or the primary level of production. As I said, farming has become more efficient in the United States, people need to go and find other stuff to do. And so what we find in growth industries in the United States tend to be more tertiary or quaternary. People who are involved in the service industry, or people involved in the development of new technologies or the new resources or new opportunities. countries that are dominated by the primary level of production tend to be developing nations. Think of places like Kenya, or places like Peru, for example, or Mexico, which is more secondary, but actually has a heavy reliance on farming to drive the economy. There's a couple of different ways of thinking about economic systems within the stratification. There's capitalism, which there's sort of two forms of capitalism. There's sort of free market capitalism, and there's sort of government regulated capitalism. The United States and most places in the world follow a more kind of free market capitalism, but with infusion of government intervention at key points. There's a central planning way of thinking about economic systems, which is more like China or the former Soviet Union, whereby the central government sort of dictates the way what are the driving forces of the economy. Ownership of major companies, like in China, tends to be from the government level, and then sort of disperses out to the population for control or access to those industries. The global economy is run by several different organizations, and as we get to different regions, we'll talk about these different companies. But it's important to understand from this particular list of potential agencies is that some driving forces for the global economy come from governmental agencies. Some of them are corporate or private financial agencies, sort of meld the corporate with the or sort of are the middle ground between the corporate and the government agencies. You then have regional agencies that affect the economy, as well as sort of offshore or off-site economic drivers or locations that are not really directly tied into the economy, but serve as holding tanks for capital or for the distribution of capital. This latter part, these kind of offshore financial centers, a lot of islands that don't have a strong local economy because they're isolated, have become, or they're really small. Countries like Andorra or Switzerland have become these major hubs where corporations, financial institutions, and governments can interact or exchange wealth and financial investment without having to follow local government rules back in another country. Again, I'll get more into this kind of development as we hit different regions of the world. Economic hubs. There's lots of economic hubs around the world. This kind of gives you a map. This map is kind of an interesting. It sort of divides economic hubs into layers. I think Oklahoma City would probably fit in the kind of gamma city. But it's important to understand that alpha cities are constantly in flux. There's not, certainly in the United States, New York, where the stock exchanges are, Chicago, where the commodity exchanges are, and Los Angeles, which it's sort of the economic hub of the West Coast, are important. But there's other ones that are on the rise or that are falling by the wayside. For example, in East Asia, the two strongest economic hubs, the alpha cities in East Asia, are actually now Shanghai and Hong Kong. Tokyo, because the Japanese stock market has subsided, is not as dramatic a hub as it used to be. Singapore is also, over the last few years, has grown in economic importance. São Paulo in Latin America is the largest economic hub for South America. This kind of gives you a little bit of a diagram of how economic hubs work, this kind of flow of trade. Again, I'll get more into this when we get into different regions. We can talk about it on a regional level and then expand that as we understand details of different regions. We can expand our understanding of trade flows between regions once you understand how certain regions are characterized. Towards the again, moving further into this idea of understanding human geography and different distinctions, cultural geography is certainly one aspect that we'll talk about more. I'm primarily, I consider myself a cultural geographer, and so my studies tend to deal with material traits and, what defines people in terms of their group dynamics. How do we form groups? Sometimes we do it based on our religious affiliations. Sometimes we base it on our geographic affiliations. Tradition, heritage is another element. Language is another element. So we'll talk more about these kinds of issues as we get into different regions. But just know right now that this is a factor that goes into understanding regional geography. This kind of gives you a map of language, different languages around the world, and how the arrows sort of point to movement, and how movement of people, migration of people, affects language. The English language, for the most part, originates in the Middle East, and over thousands of years, forms into what we have today, which is kind of a hybrid language between Romantic languages like Spanish and French, and Germanic languages like Norwegian, Dutch, German. The English language kind of combines those two. This last slide sort of shows religious influences, and when we start talking about the relationship between different countries, it is important to understand things like religion, or as an important cultural heritage, or even cultural ethnicities like what it means to be Han Chinese, which the Han, which is an ethnic group, predominantly most Chinese are of Han descent. Because of that similar ethnic background, it allows them to create a larger kind of economic sphere, and that then also translates into some religious connections. Same thing is true of Arab populations, which is why this whole area in here is so dominated by Muslims. They are either of Arab or Farsi descent, and so there's a common heritage. So religion also creates, can be a factor or a barrier, for that matter, between economic relations of two cultures. So if there's any questions about this presentation, certainly email me or text me. I'm happy to answer them. And as we move forward, we'll start talking about more specific regions of the world and deal with details that relate, things that I introduced in these first two presentations. Details will surface as we get into specific regions.